Hi geographers, let's talk about race and ethnicity. These are two of the social identifiers and self-identifiers that we mentioned in a previous video. Okay, so race, even before you write this definition in your notes that I've got on the board, please indicate that race is something that is socially constructed. That means that since culture changes from place to place, and culture is made up of all of the ideas and customs and traditions and knowledge and skills and language, etc., all of those things that we have in our notes from a couple weeks ago, culture is different from place to place. And therefore, this might be a surprise to some of us, but it's true. Race and who is categorized as a certain race or another race, those differences are not the same from one society to the next. So in this cultural tradition, certain physical characteristics might make up a certain race, and that those same people in another cultural tradition might not be classified in the same racial category together. So race uses external physical characteristics, observable characteristics, and some of the observable characteristics that are used around the world are things like hair texture, height, body size, like are you stocky and muscular or long and lean, nose shape, skin color, eye shape. These kinds of things are used all over the world to classify different types of people into different races. But races are linked to cultural tradition more than they are linked to biology. Yes, there are some biological observations that we can make about not just racial categories, but sexes in general. For instance, you can look at the pelvis of females or the number of ribs, in males, and these kinds of things to find that, whether the individual was a male or a female. There are some other observable scientific scientific observations, such as the number of pores in our skin. Females in general tend to have more pores in our skin than males do, and black females, black being a racial category based on skin color, black females tend to have more pores than anybody else, for instance. So there are some minor little things like that, but nothing so major that any racial category would be considered a different species. Not at all. Just like a toy poodle is a dog, just like your Labrador Retriever is a dog. They have different external physical characteristics, so we categorize them differently, but they're the same species, okay? So race, there's one human race, and racial categories are based on the observable external physical characteristics that a society says make this category of people that race, or this category of people another race. There's many different races. So race is a social construct. It's not based in actual fact at all, just the customs and traditions associated with your society's norms. So for instance, let me refer to a movie that some of you have watched. Actually, shame on me for calling it a movie. It's an event in history, okay? So there was a racial war or a tribal war in a country called Rwanda in the 1990s. And the movie that I was referring to is Hotel Rwanda, but please look up the actual historic event before you look up the Hollywood movie. But anyway, this was technically a race war because there were groups of people that categorized themselves based on the observable physical external characteristics. Some were tall, skinny, long, and lean with lighter skin, and some were shorter, stockier, more muscular with darker skin, and they were in two different categories. So one group was called the Watutsis, and another group was called the Hutus, and these two groups were warring. One was dominant, one was subordinate, and they were warring for control in their culture, and there was a genocide. Genocide meaning trying to wipe out an entire group of people. In this case, it was based on those racial categories. However, In the United States definition of race, people who called themselves Watutsi and people who called themselves Hutu in Rwanda would be considered the same racial category in the United States, because the external physical characteristics that we call racial identifiers in the United States are skin color and hair type. Primarily. So the Watutsis and the Hutus had the same general hair texture and skin color, and therefore they would be considered black, the racial group black, not to be confused with the ethnic identity African American, two different things. But the racial identity black in the United States and in England, for instance, where a lot of our racial categories come from originally. But anyway, around the world, there are different categories of people based on different observable physical characteristics, because this society puts importance on these physical characteristics, whereas this society puts importance on these physical characteristics. And please be aware that these, I'm chuckling a little bit because these physical characteristics are kind of silly to use as categories in my opinion. We do use them as categories, so they are real in that sense, but there are a lot of observable external physical characteristics that we don't use to categorize people. For instance, I have like really short fingers, and my best friend's fingers, if we put our hands up to each other, her fingers like overlap mine by a lot. Like she'd be a great piano player because her hands are just huge. Or for instance, my husband, I have little short squatty feet, so I have a big toe with shorter little toes afterwards, but he has a big toe with really long little toes afterwards. So lots of people have that physical characteristic. What about earlobes? Are your earlobes attached to your chin? I guess this is your chin. Or are they not attached like mine are not? These are some observable external physical characteristics that differentiate people from each other. However, those don't happen to be included in the observable physical characteristics that we in the USA use to characterize this racial category in comparison to another racial category. So, race is important only in our system of norms in our culture. It's only important in other cultures' systems of norms. It's not at all significant or important or real even from a scientific standpoint. Okay, let's look at ethnicity. Not to be confused with race. We cannot use the word race and the word ethnicity interchangeably. I hear it happening a lot. Many people do mistakenly use the word race and ethnicity interchangeably. And that's probably because here in the United States, we have an ethnic group called African American. And if you are African American, you happen to also be black, which is a racial category. Black is a racial category. African American is an ethnicity. So, ethnicities are categories of people that are categorized based on their cultural practices, their habits, their beliefs. And look at the word culture in here. Again, I'm going to refer to a couple of weeks ago when you have this long list of things that identify cultures, like your knowledge and your skills and your tools and your customs and your traditions and your language and your symbols and etc. Right? Long list of things. So these cultural traditions or cultural practices that can identify us as one ethnic group or another are markers of our social identity. I am Catholic, for instance. Therefore, I have many close friends who come from the Hispanic community because they also happen to be Catholic. So we share a ton of ethnic markers in common. I have way more in common with some of my friends who have immigrated here from Central America because of our Catholic belief system than I do my next door neighbor who goes to the cowboy church, and God bless him, he's going to the cowboy church. But it's like completely talk about identifying against the other. When he goes to the cowboy church, he worships a Christian God. When I go to the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, I am worshiping Christ and the Christian God. But wow, that's a big ethnic identifier, right? So ethnicity is based on cultural practices and habits that somebody has, your language pattern, your holidays that you observe, your religious practice. Are you Northern? Are you Southern? Can you observe a language pattern that's different from the Northern pattern of speaking compared to the Southern pattern of speaking? We're actually going to look into that when we get to the language chapter. There's a couple of videos. There's actually 6 or 7 wonderful videos that a linguist has on YouTube where he talks about the different patterns, and he has guest speakers from different ethnic backgrounds and different racial backgrounds to talk about the language, how language overlaps with these patterns of social identifying as a racial group or as an ethnic group. So these 2 words cannot be used interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. I remember teaching about this years ago. I mean, like 25 years ago, I was working at a different college than I am now. And I remember talking about the difference between race and ethnicity, and I used Black and African American, those categories at that time. And there happened to be a Black lady in my class who raised her hand, and she had never spoken in class before, so I did not know this about her. But when she spoke, she had a British accent. And I wish I could do accents, but I'm terrible at them, so I won't try to copy her. But she spoke, she said essentially, I'm so glad we're talking about this, because she worked at UAMS, I believe. She was here from England. She actually lived in some little suburb or outskirts of London. And she said so often when she would meet people and they would hear her British accent, that they would be intrigued that the British accent came out of that physical body. And she said every single time she met a new person, at some point in their new relationship, maybe not immediately, but at some point in their new relationship, they would say with amazed tone of voice, I didn't know there were African Americans in England. And they would use the word African American, meaning Black, I guess, because African American is an ethnicity in the United States that is not the same cultural marker that other Black people in other nations have. And she would always chuckle about that, and she shared with the class that she always had to correct people that they're wrong. There are no African Americans in England. There's a lot of Black people in England, but they're British. They're not American at all. And so there's a way to, I guess, make our thinking a little bit more global rather than local, because these categories or these words have to have very general definitions that go with them so that they fit every single example that you find all over the world. And that's why we have really, really general definition of race here. Notice I have not listed the specific category, the specific characteristics that identify the different racial categories in the United States. Otherness that identify against each other. I've not listed those because they're not going to be the same when you go from one place to the next. Just like with ethnicity, ethnicity is not going to always be perceived in the same way from one place to the next, but you always identify against the other based on differences in cultural practices, habits, language patterns, religious belief systems, and those kinds of things. So these are just 2 of the markers that can contribute to our self-identity. They do contribute to our self-identity, but they also contribute to our social identity. And let's please make sure that we don't limit our social identity to the local, but let's go globally too, to realize our place in the larger world of these social identity markers. Text me with questions, and I'll see you again really soon.